Welcome to Godward Podcast. I'm your host, Casey, and this is episode 2 it's episode 25, I think, but the second episode on Notes from Underground. Sometimes Notes from the Underground. I guess the article doesn't always translate out of Russian. So, I also have, I know I told you that's the best translation last time, but I'm also reading out of my Norton anthology just because that's where some of my notes are. And before I start, I actually wanted to share with some of you bibliophiles some recent updates on the home front when it comes to books. I ordered the Richmond Lattimore translation of Aeschylus's Orestia. So I think I'm going to do at least one episode, probably 3 episodes, because it's a 3-parter with Agamemnon, the libation bearers, and the Eumenides. And I did a tweet the other day about how this is, aristocratic or something to order the Lattimore, and then someone made fun of me and said, like, as if reading translations is aristocratic. So I was like, it was one of those headshots. I just had to take it and go, good point. The other thing is, if you can see, if you're watching on YouTube, look at this, baby. Look at this. This is a 160-year-old family Bible inscribed to my great-great-great-grandma, if you can believe that. And I just received it from my mom. And I don't know, it's something else, man. And she's got she was a Bible reader. So you've got these marks in here. I'll share a couple of them on Twitter, I guess. I mean, it's pretty cool. There's this little X next to John chapter 10, verse 27. My sheep hear my voice, and I know them, and they follow me. And it's like, man, that goes back a long time. It was inscribed in 1862, and it's just cool to me that great-great-great-grandma was reading the Gospels. So sometimes we talk about being trad, but sometimes you just got to be lucky. Someone has to bequeath you a little bit of tradition. All right, so speaking of tradition, the opposite of tradition was that Dostoevsky stuff last time. Very modern. And I think that's a big part of the problem. I mean, to me, it seems like a problem that this guy is dealing with. Oh, by the way, before I get really into it, sorry about the audio on the last episode. It should be crystal clear again. I just had the wrong microphone turned on or whatever. So in part 1, what we saw was this 40-year-old guy who was a real grouch, basically, talking about how he doesn't like to be pushed around. He doesn't like making friends at the office. He hates being nudged in that Cass Sunstein kind of scientism sort of way. And basically, it's him being a crank in part 1, being a 40-year-old loner crank. But part 2, as I said, and I set this up at the end of the last episode, if you could hear it, He says, I'm going to tell you a story now, something that just came to mind yesterday, which, first of all, is kind of doubtful. I mean, this guy really seems so hyper self-conscious that my guess is that, he's saying that, but really this is a poignant story, right? So that's probably what's going on here. And what's the story? Okay, it begins by him saying, at that time, I was only 24 years old. Even then, my life was gloomy, disordered, and solitary to the point of savagery. I didn't associate with anyone. I even avoided talking, and I retreated further and further into my corner. At work in the office, I even tried not to look at anyone. I was aware not only that my colleagues considered me eccentric, but that they always seemed to regard me with a kind of loathing. So this is him when he's 24, right out of college, or whatever, and he's starting his business job, and, I mean, not doing great, I would say. I mean, the attitude problem here is sort of starting. I'm skipping a little, but the next paragraph says, of course, I hated all my fellow office workers from the first to the last, and despised every one of them. Yet, at the same time, it was as if I were afraid of them. Sometimes it happened that I would even regard them as superior to me. At this time, these changes would suddenly occur. First, I would despise them, and then I would regard them as superior to me. A cultured and decent man cannot be vain without making unlimited demands on himself and without hating himself, at times to the point of contempt. But whether hating them or regarding them as superior, I almost always lowered my eyes when meeting anyone. This is so interesting. Let me keep reading. I even conducted experiments. Could I endure someone's gaze? I'd always be the first to lower my eyes. This infuriated me to the point of madness. I slavishly worshipped the conventional in everything external. I embraced the common practice and feared any eccentricity with all my soul. But how could I sustain it? I was morbidly refined, as befits any cultured man of our time. All others resembled one another as sheep in a flock. And then he goes on to say, every decent man of our time is and must be a coward and a slave. Wow. Dark, isn't it? I mean, the thing is, it's like, okay, actually, let me get to the end of this, because he keeps going this long paragraph about this, and then he says, there was one more circumstance tormenting me at that time. No one was like me. And I wasn't like anyone else. I'm alone, I mused. And they are everyone. And I sank deep into thought. And then he says, in the very next line, one of those one-sentence paragraphs, quote, from all this, it's clear that I was still just a boy. Ooh, isn't that devastating? Like, so what he's saying here, I mean, in some sense, like, I assume you've felt this. Like, almost everyone has felt this, where you feel all alone and, like, you're an eccentric, but everybody else is just a normie, and, you know, like they could never understand me. There are so many layers to me, but they're all so simple, and they just watch baseball and whatever. And so he's feeling that, but then, remember, he's 40 when he's narrating this, and so he's gotten 16 years of perspective on his former 24-year-old self here. And now, looking back, he says, it's clear I was just a boy. Like, I hadn't yet really understood that basically everybody feels like that when they're 24, right? But I love what he says next. He says, sometimes I would find it repulsive to go to the office. It reached the point where I would often return home from work ill, and then suddenly, for no good reason at all, a flash of skepticism and indifference would set in. Everything came to me in flashes. I would laugh at my own intolerance and fastidiousness and reproach myself for my romanticism. He highlights the word, he italicizes it. It's a big deal, right? Blah, blah, blah. All my fastidiousness would suddenly disappear for no good reason. Who knows? Perhaps I never really had any, and it was all affected, borrowed from books. This is one of my favorite themes. I love thinking about this. He's basically becoming conscious of the fact that, like, when he was at work and when he was in these, moments of, like, fastidiousness or annoyance or whatever, that feeling even was kind of received from books. That he had read enough romantic fiction that he kind of knew that he was supposed to be bothered by other people or whatever. And so he starts to wonder, like, have I just sort of drunk in these narratives that were handed to me when in fact they weren't me? I just started performing them, right? I've given you my old example about, watching so many episodes of Friends or whatever, and then you just start to behave like one of these characters because, like, it seems like that's what we're supposed to do, and you take it on as your own personality. But, like, given enough time to reflect on it, you may discover that's not actually you, right? So, okay, that's kind of the setup here. He does say he spends most of his time reading, which I know, like, most of you probably don't, but, like, think about the modern contemporary 2020 equivalent of that, right? You do actually spend most of your time on your phone, basically reading. I mean, watching YouTube videos counts, watching Netflix counts, Watching the news even counts because it's a kind of narrative, right? And so all of these are like feeding you, programming. And, basically we accept them. We very often just kind of reflect back to these media sort of what they want out of us. So, all right, the next thing that happens is he's talking about seeing this he goes out to a tavern one night, and like he's just looking to make trouble or something, and he finally kind of like tries to get in a fight with this guy, but this guy like hardly even notices him because he's like a real roughneck, and he kind of just like shoulders past him. This, our narrator takes as like a total humiliation, but he's drunk and he's depressed, and he basically just gets thrown out of this bar, and it's terrible. And he says at one point, "I could have forgiven even a beating, but I could never forgive his moving me out of the way and entirely failing to notice me." So you can start to see that what happens here is that his like psychologically, he's very bothered by being invisible to people, by being like, low on the social rung or something. So he starts to follow this guy around. He sees him around town, and he like plots his revenge, which is that he's going to like see him coming one day in Nevsky Prospect and just shoulder him so hard, right? So he plans this and plans it and plans it. Of course, the other guy knows nothing about this, doesn't care. But eventually it always, he's bothered by, why are you always the first one to step aside when there's two on the sidewalk? Why is it always you who breaks eye contact first, right? And he's like humiliating himself and shaming himself. And so this time he's going to not step off the sidewalk, and he's not going to break eye contact with this guy and see what happens. And so he finally does it and shoulders this guy, and he's like, "Oh man, I did it." And he kind of turns around to look. And of course that guy just keeps walking. He's like totally not conscious of him. And so even that doesn't give him the fix he needs, because this guy doesn't even notice the whole stupid mental game that this guy's been playing with himself. So that's the beginning of part 2. And then what happens is he gets kind of vaguely invited to this like high school reunion party kind of thing, and he goes and he gets too drunk and he says a bunch of stuff that's kind of embarrassing and like kind of like on the wrong wavelength from these guys that he used to go to school with. And essentially they say they're going to a brothel next or something, but then like when he tries to meet them there, they're not there, or they've already left or something. And so he ends up going alone, is the point I'm trying to make. I'm kind of skipping some of this old high school reunion stuff to get to my favorite part of part 2. So basically he sleeps with this prostitute, and it's, of course it happens like off stage, so he wakes up next to her, okay? And I love this description so much because it's like, again, he's 40 now. He's reflecting on this, right? It happened 16 years ago. He's had 16 years to like think about how to narrate it so that it makes sense. So that he's like doing an interpretation of his life, right? All these details are very careful now. So he says, okay, my mind was in a daze. It was as though something were hanging over me, provoking, agitating, and disturbing me. Misery and bile were welling inside me, seeking an outlet. Suddenly I noticed beside me 2 wide-open eyes, examining me curiously and persistently. The gaze was coldly detached, sullen, as if belonging to a total stranger. I found it oppressive. Now this is the prostitute he just slept with, right? And the first image we get is of her locking eyes with him and not breaking eye contact, right? And remember, this is already on his mind. It's like, why can't I not be the one to break eye contact first? Which, by the way, try this sometimes. It's one of the hardest things to do. Like, your body will get like an adrenaline rush. It's one of these things that we've internalized so deeply, but like it signifies social status and rank and power and all that stuff. And so if you lock eyes with somebody that's like, that normally that you would have to break eye contact with, and you don't this time, very socially awkward moments can happen. They might either get mad. I mean, in male-female stuff, it's going to be perceived as flirting or something, even if it's not. I had a friend once who tried this and said he almost got in a fight with some guy. He had to walk over across the room after staring at this guy for a minute and finally explain himself and be like, "Sorry, I'm just doing this psychology experiment. I know that was weird." So that's kind of what's going on here. He says, A dismal thought was conceived in my brain and spread throughout my whole body like a nasty sensation, such as one feels upon entering a damp, moldy underground cellar. It was somehow unnatural that only now these two eyes had decided to examine me. I also recalled that during the course of the last 2 hours I hadn't said one word to this creature, and that I had considered it quite unnecessary. That had even given me pleasure for some reason. Now, I'd suddenly realized starkly how absurd, how revolting as a spider was the idea of debauchery, which, without love, crudely and shamelessly begins precisely at the point where genuine love is consummated. We looked at each other in this way for some time, but she didn't lower her gaze before mine, nor did she alter her stare, so that finally, for some reason, I felt very uneasy. So then what he does is he goes into this attempt to try to humiliate her. You can feel that all this guy wants is just a shred of like dignity and respect from anyone else in the world, even a prostitute, right? But it's not going to work. I mean, basically it's all going to backfire. He starts trying to shame her. He's like, he'll say things to her like, "You're young and pretty and fresh. That's your value. But after a year of this life, you won't be like that anymore. You'll fade." It's like he's trying to red pill her on sex and gender or something, and she's not buying it at all. She just will not give him the kind of, like, what would that be? Like the shame signal or something that he's trying to get. Because if she does, then he would feel better, right? He would be like, well, at least I'm not a prostitute. But she doesn't do that. She's not into this game. She doesn't feel shame, and so he can't get the fix that he needs in terms of like feeling, above someone on the social ladder. He said, so 16 years later, he's aware of this. It's not nice behavior. I mean, he really like starts to, stick a dagger at her, kind of, shaming her and whatever. And at one point he says, this is 16 years later, but he says, it was the sport that attracted me most of all. So he's like, he's not really, he doesn't care whether she reforms herself or gets married or any of that stuff. He's just trying to get a rise out of her, kind of. But at the end of chapter 6 in part 2, there's this incredible scene where like they're still lying there together and she still isn't really blinking, And so finally she interrupts him in the middle of one of his long like lectures on, values or whatever. And she says, "Somehow you ... And the narrator says, "She began suddenly and then stopped. But I understood everything already. Something was trembling in her voice now, not shrill, rude, or unyielding as before, but something soft and timid, so timid that I suddenly was rather ashamed to watch her and felt guilty." "What?" I asked with tender curiosity. "Well, you... Again. Remember, this is him and the prostitute he just slept with that he's trying to shame. And he goes, "What?" And she goes, "You somehow... It sounds just like a book," she said. And once again, something which was noticeably sarcastic was suddenly heard in her voice. And then he says, "Her remark wounded me dreadfully. That's not what I had expected." So why is he wounded by that? He's wounded because this woman is a real person, right? Like she's lived her life. She's not acting like a character in a TV show. It's not like she's trying to mimic someone else's Instagram account. That's what's going on here. And he all of a sudden he's caught. Like he's caught. She called him out and she just owned him basically. So anyway, he doubles down. I mean, it gets embarrassing to try to read this stuff because he keeps trying to shame her and make fun of her. And then he gives her his address, but it's like a shit test or something. And then she does show up. And so they're going to have basically another long conversation. And he still kind of can't get what he wants out of this stuff. He does. I mean, his reflection 16 years later is aware of he sees that he should have been ashamed at the time, but he wasn't ashamed when it was happening. He says, power. It was the power I needed then. I craved the sport. I wanted to reduce you to tears, humiliation, hysteria. That's what I needed then. But I couldn't have endured it myself because I'm such a wretch. I got scared. The devil only knows why I foolishly gave you my address. Afterward, even before I got home, I cursed you like nothing on earth on account of that address. I hated you already because I'd lied to you then. But then he keeps trying. He goes, this is when he's still talking to her, I guess, a couple weeks later. But do you know what I really want now? For you to get lost. That's what. I need to get some peace. Okay, so like he's still trying to yell. And finally he says, but at this point, a very strange thing suddenly occurred. I'd become so accustomed to inventing and imagining everything according to books and picturing everything on earth to myself just as I'd conceived of it in my dreams, that at first I couldn't even comprehend the meaning of this strange occurrence. But here's what happened. Liza, that's the prostitute, Liza, insulted and crushed by me, understood much more than I'd imagined. She understood out of all this what a woman always understands first of all, if she sincerely loves, namely, that I myself was unhappy. So I think that's where in the story he starts to realize that like he's never going to get one over on her. If anything, like he's the low one on the totem pole here. So he does start to admit that he was ashamed and that he was only doing it to exercise power and stuff. He says at one point, in the first place, I could no longer love because, I repeat, for me, love meant tyrannizing and demonstrating my moral superiority. And then he says, however, I didn't hate her so much as I rushed around the room and peered through the crack behind the screen. I merely found it unbearably painful that she was still there. I wanted her to disappear. I longed for peace and quiet. I wanted to remain alone in my underground. Real life oppressed me. So unfamiliar was it that I even found it hard to breathe. Isn't that amazing? That's like, it's like so relevant. It feels like this is exactly about 2020, about all of the people who are stuck indoors looking at the computer and stuff. And then it's like, you get an opportunity to like, I'm talking to my younger viewers here, go out to a party, go on a date or whatever. Actually it's true for me too, like take my wife somewhere or something. And it's like, it would just be so much easier to like stay on the couch and, watch another rerun of something. And so this whole thing about being bookish really translates in the 21st century to being like someone who's plugged in, who's always like looking, because you're in control when you're looking at your phone, you're thumbing through it and so on. So, okay, he says, let's see, I'm looking for 7:30. So then he says, okay, so now so basically that's the story with Liza and the prostitute. He seems to kind of come to insight at the end of all that, sort of. And then there's going to be about, I'm going to read you the rest of this. So 3 more paragraphs here. These are my favorite 3 paragraphs of Dostoevsky. Maybe in this story. So here's what he says. You can kind of feel the narrative unframe itself. So now he goes back to talking in the voice of part 1, basically. He goes back to being 40 years old. Like he's told you the story of when he was 24 and he tried to humiliate a prostitute, but basically it just backfired and she ended up humiliating him, teaching him a lesson. Okay? So then he says, even now, after so many years, all this comes back to me as very unpleasant. A great deal that comes back to me now is very unpleasant, but perhaps I should end these notes here. Like, wouldn't it be interesting if he just stopped there and there was no more reflection? Like, he just told you the story of the prostitute and the humiliation and then he was like, that's it. But he's not going to do that. He's going to, I think, make the mistake of continuing to talk. He goes, I think that I made a mistake in beginning to write these notes. At least I was ashamed all the time I was writing this tale. Consequently, it's not really literature, but corrective punishment. After all, to tell you long stories about how, for example, I ruined my life through moral decay in my corner, by the lack of appropriate surroundings, by isolation from any living beings, and by futile malice in the underground. So help me God, that's not very interesting. A novel needs a hero, whereas here, all the traits of an anti-hero have been assembled deliberately. But the most important thing is that all this produces an extremely unpleasant impression because we've all become estranged from life. We're all cripples. Every one of us, more or less. And you feel when he says that, that's the first time in the story that he turns to saying we all, you. He's trying to bring you in with him at the end of this story. And it's objectionable because it's like, dude, I never embarrassed myself in front of my high school friends and then went to a brothel and further embarrassed myself in front of a prostitute. Like, I'm not that bad, right? And so when he says, like, we're all broken, we're all cripples, we're all estranged from life, your instinct is to go like, no way, dude, that's you. I'm up here, you're down there. But do you catch what's going on at that point? If you're doing that, you're doing exactly what he was trying to do to the prostitute, right? You're making the same mistake that he made, that humiliated him ultimately, by saying, look at me, I've got my life together. I'm up here. At least I'm not like that underground man, okay? That's the trap that he sets at the end of this. And I really think it's like basically inescapable. He says, we've become so estranged. Estranged means like alienated and aloof and separate from each other. We've become so estranged that at times we feel some kind of revulsion for genuine, real life. And therefore we can't bear to be reminded of it. Why, we've reached a point where we almost regard real life as hard work, as a job, and we've all agreed in private that it's really better on Twitter. He says on books, but do you catch what I'm doing here? I mean, that's what he's saying, right? And that's how so many people seem to think at this point. He says, actually, let me read that again. I'll just read it without interfering with it. He says, we've reached a point where we almost regard real life as hard work, as a job, and we've all agreed in private that it's really better in books. And why do we sometimes fuss, indulge in whims, and make demands? We don't know ourselves. It'd be even worse if all our whimsical desires were fulfilled. Go on, try it. Give us, for example, a little more independence. Untie the hands of any one of us. Broaden our sphere of activity. Relax the controls. And, I can assure you, we'll immediately ask to have the controls reinstated. I know that you may get angry at me for saying this. You may shout and stamp your feet. Speak for yourself, you'll say, and for your own miseries in the underground. See how he's you see how he's out ahead of us all the time? Because that is exactly what I want to say. As I'm reading this, and as he's saying all this stuff, you want to be like, yo, dude, that's your problem. I don't have this psychosis. I'm past it all. I'm living in the real world. But it's like, you really introspect and you start to realize, no, I'm addicted to my phone. I spend all this time reading books. It's easier to just kind of retreat into these isolated sort of, controlled chambers, basically. So speak for yourself, you'll say, and for your own miseries in the underground, but don't you dare say all of us. But if you'll allow me, gentlemen, after all, I'm not trying to justify myself by saying all of us. What concerns me in particular is that in my life, I've only taken to an extreme that which you haven't even dared to take halfway. What's more, you've mistaken your cowardice as good sense. And in so deceiving yourself, you've consoled yourself. So in fact, I may be even more alive than you are. Just take a closer look. Why, we don't even know where this real life lives nowadays, what it really is, and what it's called. Leave us alone without books, or Instagram, or Twitter, and we'll get confused and lose our way at once. We won't know what to join, what to hold on to, what to love or what to hate, what to respect or what to despise. We're even oppressed by being men with real bodies and blood of our very own. We're ashamed of it. We consider it a disgrace, and we strive to become some kind of impossible general human beings. We're stillborn. For some time now, we haven't been conceived by living fathers. We like it more and more. We're developing a taste for it. Soon we'll conceive of a way to be born from ideas. But enough. I don't want to write anymore from underground. However, the notes of this paradoxicalist don't end here. He couldn't resist and kept on writing, but it also seems to us that we might as well stop here. The end. So that's the notes from the underground. Amazing, isn't it? I mean, part of me thinks, honestly, I don't think it's the only way to read this, but like, if we're trying to take a 19th century text and see why it's still relevant and how it's still alive. And so what you have to do is kind of intensify the terms. It's like when Henry David Thoreau picks on the worshipers of the railroad. Well, it's not just the railroad, right? It's like he's talking about technology in general. So, from there, what we really mean is the cell phone, not just the railroad, but the cell phone, air travel, etc. Like, we know that if he were here, he would be complaining about those things. And the same goes for Notes from the Underground, where you've got this guy complaining about spending too much time in books and living underground and isolating and stuff. And it's like, man, I gotta say, like, that's so common, right? In fact, like, you might think I'm gonna, like, shame you if you've got, like, one of those avatar careers on Twitter where you don't actually use your real face and name, and you don't have a podcast with your own face and voice on it and stuff. But I mean, honestly, like, even this is a kind of escape, right? It's like, because I'm very in control, I can turn it off whenever I want to. We don't have to hang out in real life very much. You know what I mean? We can schedule our secret streams for the patrons and so on. And I think, like, even that is a kind of escape. Better than this would be if I, invited the neighbor over and tried to explain Notes from the Underground to him. But of course I don't, because I get this feeling like he wouldn't want to do that, like, and I wouldn't be interested in his stupid sports ball game or whatever. And so it's better if we just kind of, dig deeper into our respective rabbit holes on the internet, right? Does anyone have other thoughts about this stuff? I mean, I'm not going to do this from memory here, rather than, it was too long of a quote, but basically there's another, I think it's a journal quote from Dostoevsky, where he says something like, if someone could prove to me that the truth were not with Christ, I would go with Christ rather than the truth, even though it meant damnation or something like that, which is just a wild, like, what a thing to say, right? And I'm not even sure what he means exactly. I mean, it's like, is that Christian, or is that like a kind of weird sort of idolatry or something? Because it's like, it's a strange division to try to make in your head. I guess the point is that you have to take him as a Christian. I mean, he wrote a lot about it. He was certainly interested in it. He was, like he said it, like I quoted him saying in the last episode, not a child about his religion. This was like intense to him. He had thought through it a lot. Very famously, he had been led up to be executed at one point in his life and like given a reprieve at the very last second. So like he was almost a dead man. He had given all kinds of thought to this stuff. He was also a epileptic, and epileptics often have like the temporal lobe seizures, which lead to like mystical feelings. He was one of these. So no doubt he's very serious about, religious consciousness, mysticism, and so on. I don't think I don't know. To me, it's like, so the question is, why write a story about such an obvious failure of a person? Such, you know what I mean? Like, why present an anti-hero? I mean, interestingly, he tried to do it the other way. He wrote a book called The Idiot, which featured a protagonist who was basically as Jesus-like as you can get. And he did this too famously in the chapter in Brothers Karamazov that everybody quotes after Rebellion, the Grand Inquisitor, where like the idea is if Jesus came back today. I mean, if you've never read the Grand Inquisitor, like you really have to go read that. But I mean, basically, Jesus comes back and like the Catholic Church has got it all figured out. Now, of course, like, you know, Dostoevsky's an Eastern Orthodox guy, and so he's criticizing the Roman Church, but it's still sort of, he gets it. I mean, I like this idea that, you know, again, institutions get to feeling proud of themselves, and it's very hard for them to like stay in touch with the idea that they only function by God's grace, or that they're, you know what I mean, that they're like, that's their real foundation. And so the criticism is that if Jesus came back today, the bishops would just put him in jail and get rid of him because it would just mess things up for them or something, you know. So he's very interested in all of these ideas. I guess the question is, why the anti-hero? And I think it has to be because he's trying to give us like he's trying to like warn us away from these mistakes that this guy is making. Something like that, I suppose, to be happening in this story. And the main mistakes seem to be this desire for recognition among the world or among people or your peers or something. That seems to be, that's what happened first when he was 24, right? He wants the approval of his high school classmates or this general, the guy at the bar that's bigger than him and that like shoulders him and ignores him and stuff. And it's because he doesn't get the recognition from them and then from the people at his office and so on, that eventually, like, I think rather than like, it would be interesting to try to see, like, what would the right attitude to that be? Like, I'm thinking of the main character in The Idiot, Prince Mishkin. Like, what he would do is just nothing. Like, he would just keep going to coffee if anyone ever invited him, but when they didn't, he would just study and wait. You know what I mean? Like, that's all you can do, sort of. It reminds me of the end of that Milton poem that says, you know, I think it's on his blindness, they also serve who only stand and wait. And so sometimes, you know, it's like, sometimes in history it seems like, you know, you get an opportunity to be a martyr or charge into battle for the Lord or something. Other times, maybe you just have to like put up with this grinding, what's that word he used instead of alienation? Like, yeah, whatever I quoted earlier. So maybe that's a way of serving God somehow. I don't know. But in any case, maybe stay away from the brothel. And if you go, probably just pay her and say thank you. I mean, that seems to be the more Christian thing to do. If I did manage this, there's a video that came to mind while I was talking that I wanted to plug in earlier. So I think I'll try to figure out a way to do that. I'm also thinking, I don't know, like, we'll see what you guys think. I was going to try to post some, like, funny images or something through this, because I'm learning how to use iMovie and edit video and audio and stuff. I don't know, like, are you really, like, what I do when I listen to people on YouTube is just put the phone in my pocket and I'm just listening to it like a podcast. I mean, how many of you are, like, watching this just to see my face move? Wouldn't it be more interesting if I sometimes popped up, like, images of, I don't know, something funny along the way? So maybe I'll think about doing some of those for this one, because I'm filming it only the day after the last one. Okay, what did we say for next time? Since I have 3 minutes left here or so, I wanted to say, I'm going to pull up the Patreon page, because I posted there, I think I made it public. I tried to make it, you can post for the public or just for your active patrons, but I recently put one up about the shows that are coming soon, and I think I made it public. So if you do want to visit my Patreon page, you can find the link on Twitter or elsewhere. I mean, just look for it. Or if you just Google Godward Podcast on Patreon. But anyway, it says we were going to do 2 eps on Notes from the Underground, and then one on William James and mysticism. Let's do that one next, and then then let's do Dante. Or I might throw in the Book of Jonah before Dante, because I've been thinking about Jonah a lot lately. Jonah almost reminds me of Notes from the Underground in a way, because because what does he do, right? He tries to run away from God. God calls him. God says to Jonah, go into Nineveh. Nineveh's the big city, and tell them they're all a bunch of degenerates and to repent. And it's like, nobody really wants to do that, right? Like that's not going to be popular in the big city. So it's like, I would rather not, God. And so he kind of runs away and basically tries to live in the underground, but eventually you know the story. And I thought, it's only a 4-page story. I might just read it to you and then sort of comment as we go as an episode. But we're going to get to Dante pretty soon. I know people want to hear the Dante stuff. We'll do one episode on the beginning of it, which I frame as sort of a midlife crisis sort of a thing, and the psychology and the meaning of the symbolism and all that stuff, and the architecture of hell. And then we'll do one episode on, yes, we're going to do the episode on usury and sodomy. I mean, I'm just trying to summarize Dante here. What do you want from me? And then we'll talk about Dante, the poet, and the idea of ineffability, which he returns to a lot in about the last 4 cantos of Inferno. So those will be, maybe I'll do 3 episodes even on Dante if people are liking it. I feel like I can make some good fiery thumbnails for Netflix too. Oh, by the way, I'm also taking submissions. I should have said that. I'm taking submissions for thumbnails. So if anyone wants to make YouTube thumbnails, I'm not promising anything because I love to make them. So if I like my own better than yours, then that's what you're going to have to deal with. But I'll even just read to you even faster than I just did the upcoming episodes, so that if you are inclined, you want to make, if you're like VDR and you draw pictures, or you want to make for any of these, you want to make the screen cap, I'll give you a credit on the episode if I choose one of yours. So 2 episodes on Notes from the Underground. We just did those. 1 on William James and mysticism. 2 on Dante. 1 on Jorge Luis Borges' short story, The Garden of Forking Paths. 1 on the Book of Jonah. 1 on Aeschylus and the Orestia. 1 on Albert Camus and Metaphysical Rebellion. That'll not be Myth of Sisyphus, but on his book, The Rebel. 1 on Edgar Allan Poe and Perverseness. 1 on Nietzsche's Zarathustra, and then 1 more on Polybius's Histories. So those are the upcoming episodes. Here's the outro music. I'll see you next time on Godward, the podcast.